Hey everybody, Chris here. I wanted to let you know about something cool that our supporting sponsor, RAB, is doing. Over the past 3 years, they've proudly partnered with a group called Ladies Weekend Out, supplying high-quality demo gear to help facilitate transformative outdoor experiences. And this year, RAB is sponsoring scholarships to LWO events, making their educational programs more accessible than ever and helping to empower women in the outdoors. You can apply for one of those scholarships at the link in the show notes. The deadline is March 15th. I hope you win. You care about your climbing, right? Of course you do. Then you owe it to yourself to provide the best options for improving. And when it comes to training equipment and boards, that means tension climbing. The Tension Board 2 isn't just a bunch of holds scattered randomly on a board. Those days are history. This board is intentionally designed to help you become a better climber faster by people who actually use the board every day. There's just no substitute. Use the code WRITTEN15 at checkout for 15% off of select goods. It was 1986, over halfway through a decade that had brought turbulent change to climbing, and it was clear to him that even here in Yosemite, hallowed ground as far as he was concerned, ethics were shifting. The last time an advancement in pure difficulty had happened here in the valley was in 1977 with Ray Jardine's The Phoenix. Sure, people still traveled here to do the big walls and to climb some of the classics, but the world knew that Yosemite and the once mighty best climbers in the world who called Camp 4 home were now way behind. He'd gone to Germany and taunted them with the route chasing the train, but it hadn't taken long for Wolfgang Gulich and, well, most everybody else to board that train, kick out the conductor, rob the passengers, and steer it straight to 514. But John Bachar had an idea of how he could get this train back on track. It wasn't the first time he'd had to do this, and he knew exactly who he'd ask for help. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
In 1976, John Bachar walked out of UCLA and never looked back. There was no cap and gown, no diploma, and while his father, who was a UCLA math professor, was hoping for a different outcome, his logical brain accepted his son's decision. Quit school to become the best climber in the world. In fact, he may have already held that title. If not, he was certainly in the running. By the start of the 1980s, he'd earned the nickname Johnny Rock, appeared in television commercials and on programs like That's Incredible and Survival of the Fittest. He'd climbed some of the hardest routes in the world and had free soloed at a level higher than pretty much anyone. But he'd also seen the writing on the wall. In 1981, he went to Germany with a mission in mind. While he'd been invited as a guest speaker, he also wanted to prove that the Yosemite style and ethics weren't as outdated as some were saying, that hard routes could be climbed without resorting to the new age tactics like hangdogging. And he made his point, doing the hardest route in the country at the time, chasing the train. But on the long flight back to the US, he had plenty of time to let it sink in. He knew the world was headed toward more and more bolts, often placed on rappel, and that people would inevitably hang on those bolts to figure out the next sequence, and then repeat and repeat and again and again. There was no stopping this train, and he knew it. But he didn't have to step aside quietly. He needed to make a statement. But he also had to be honest with himself. Sticking to his ethics by the letter would mean that it wouldn't be long before he was completely surpassed. He'd seen as much in the young climber who'd done chasing the train shortly after he did, Wolfgang Gulich. While in Germany, he'd seen the climbers using leg loops with their Swami belts and had adopted that, but he'd also heard about the ethics in the East German free climbing center of the Elbsandstein. There, routes were developed ground up, and ring bolts would be drilled while the leader hung from a knotted sling stuffed into a crack, or a sling over a knob, or some other method of holding their body weight for long enough to get the bolt in. That wasn't quite up to the ethical code he adhered to and believed to be the most pure. But it wasn't new and focused on difficulty either. It still involved what he considered to be fair play, adventure. So sitting there, on the flight back, he made a tough choice. If it came down to it, and he assumed that it might, he would compromise. Once back on the familiar ground of Yosemite, John headed to Tuolumne Meadows, where several of the knobbly domes seemed impenetrable without the new top-down tactics, and people had already started talking about bringing wrap bolting to these walls. He couldn't let that happen. Not yet. But before he could act on his plan, he needed to figure out how to make it work. He doubted there would be enough no-hand stances on the route that he had decided to do, so he would have to use what he'd learned about the East German ethics to figure out how to drill bolts. To his surprise, directly in front of the wall he'd chosen, he found a boulder field that had the exact same features as his intended route: protruding knobs and crystals. This would be the perfect place to practice his compromise. Compromise doesn't mean easy. It took the better part of a week to realize that slings over knobs just wasn't going to work. But skyhooks on some of the more positive knobs would do the trick, allowing him to tap, twist, his hand drill for long enough to get a hole where he'd install a potentially life-saving bolt. By his estimation, this wouldn't exactly be a free climb because of how he'd prepared it, but he wouldn't claim that. Of course, at the same time, many of the best free climbs in the valley had been made possible by the passage of aid climbers somehow altering the rock, pin scars for finger locks or bolt ladders for protection. Was this really any different? Rumor said that Bridwell himself had placed, removed, replaced, and re-removed pitons just to facilitate a shorter timeline to free climbing a section of a route. Or maybe it wasn't rumor. Maybe he'd seen it and decided to turn a blind eye. So what he was about to do was minimal in comparison. He'd drill only as many bolts as were absolutely necessary, and if that meant that he had to drill between no-hand stances, he'd do it while hanging from a hook, hoping that the tap-twisting of the drill bit wouldn't knock the hook from its precarious perch on an irregular knob, sending him plummeting down the wall. He would keep the ground-up adventure. He would keep the risk. Hypocritical? Maybe, but to him, the compromise was acceptable. So he went in search of a willing partner. Valley local Dave Yerian was sitting at the Tuolumne store, innocently sipping on coffee, when Bachar approached him. "Want to go do a new route?" Bachar asked, as if it was going to be just another random climb. He didn't let on that the new route was going to be a statement of ethics. Dave said yes. This was John Bachar, Johnny Rock. Of course, Dave said yes. But if he'd remembered that message tacked on the bulletin board in Camp 4, he might have hesitated, or asked a few questions before eagerly jumping on board. $10,000 to anyone who can follow me for a day. Signed, John Bachar. There were no takers. A few years earlier, Bachar had free-soloed the Nabisco Wall, 3 pitches of strenuous crack climbing, the second of which is Butterballs, a splitter finger crack with a few smeary bumps for feet that goes at 11C. And he had on-site free-soloed the Moratorium, a multi-pitch 511 with an insecure stemming corner that left him ready to bail, but unable to downclimb. There was nobody else free-soloing anywhere near that level. Bachar led Dave through the trees to a crackless 500-foot vertical black streak and pointed up it. Now Dave had some second thoughts. But again, this was John Bachar. And as Dave tilted his head back, trying his best to take in both the magnitude of the route and the magnitude of the risk, he noticed something 60 feet up the wall, glinting in the sunshine. A lone bolt. Dave realized that John was serious, and that he'd already gotten it started. Solo. Indeed, John had already been here and had free soloed 60 feet up where he'd found a no-hand stance and put in the first bolt. With Dave unsure but on belay, John repeated the solo to the first bolt, clipped it, and kept climbing. Before long, he found another suitable knob for a hook placement and decided to place another bolt, not knowing when the next one might appear. And because hanging on a hook gave him time to rest his forearms before he continued climbing, which to him felt like cheating, he decided on a way to even the playing field. After each new bolt that he drilled from a hook, he would lower down to the highest no-hand stance that he'd found. This way, he reasoned, he would be climbing it more like future climbers would experience it. His hypocrisy, it appeared, went only so far. Further up, a slung knob and an expanding flake offered a bit of mental protection, though Bachar doubted either would actually hold a fall, which at this point would be 50 feet directly to the slabs below. He focused himself for an insecure layback move and made it to a ledge where he installed 2 belay bolts and a third bolt that he would clip first on the next lead so that if he couldn't find more gear before he fell off, at least he wouldn't be falling directly onto the belay bolts. Dave followed, and together they decided to wrap off. They were both mentally fried. In a great essay about the route, John wrote, "For the next 2 days I dreamed about the route. Knobs would pop up like mushrooms, then wilt and shrink, and I'd be grasping for life as one by one they fell off. How bad could it get? This bad. Hey John, how you feel? You okay? Yeah, I'm okay. Hey John, you okay? What's it look like? Shut up, Dave. He'd repeated the first pitch with no falls. Then he was 50 feet out on the second pitch with only 2 bolts. And after each bolt placement, he lowered to the belay and climbed up again. Now, he was high above that second bolt, not finding suitable hook placements, facing a decision. Do I go left or do I go right? He chose left. He chose unwisely. Facing a move on a small knob with a crack running through it, he resorted to the tactic that so far had worked. Commit. He grabbed the knob carefully, testing it, gingerly moved his feet, and with a level of commitment not many can muster, he pulled the cracked knob to his waist and trusted his weight to it, standing and reaching high above his head to what looked like the only option. The knob snapped. In slow motion, he watched as the wall got further from his outstretched hand. He spun 180 degrees, facing out, looking down at Tenaya Lake and the tops of the pine trees, and windmilled through over 50 feet of air before the rope caught and he slammed back to Medlicott Dome. Unbelievably, he went back up. This time, he chose to go right. From the essay. Climbing is a journey of devotion. The environment, by its severity, dictates movements of the spirit. At last, I entered a kind of trance state, taking each set of knobs and choices at a time, looking ahead 3 or 4 moves for some good crystal that I could aim for, solid enough for me to stop and gaze about some more, or even hang a hook. I imagined playing a chess game in which the pieces kept shifting with me. He soon got a third bolt in, and shortly after, another belay ledge. And again, having had enough, the pair wrapped off. A few days later, having exercised the short-term memory that keeps so many of us climbing, they were back. This day would be less eventful. Bachar would climb from the ground to the top with no falls, no reliance on gear outside of the belays, and in a move that he knew would irk the progressive climbers who were antsy to start wrap bolting, the name he gave the route would be a throwback to another time altogether, when routes were simply named after the first ascensionists. Just like the Stek Salathe or the Chenard Herbert, this route became the Bachar-Yerian. At 511 plus R or X, the route wasn't at the top of the difficulty scale. But that wasn't the point. He was well aware that just the knowledge that something had already been done made it easier to repeat. Whether 510 or 513, this was true. So he'd made that as difficult as possible. Yes, it's been done. There are definitely holds up there, so yes, it's climbable. At a relatively pedestrian grade, no less. But can you climb it? John Bachar knew that not many could. This episode of Written in Stone is brought to you by Rab. For more than 40 years, Rab have been crafting rugged, high-performance clothing and equipment that give you absolute protection, comfort, and freedom in the mountains. With roots in the climbing community of Sheffield, UK, they're dedicated climbers themselves, and they channel this expertise and passion into their designs. Nothing fancy or over-engineered, just honest, hard-working gear you'd rather repair than replace. Rab are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business, make it fairer for everyone, and expand access to the outdoors. Whether it's phasing out fluorocarbons or giving used gear a second life through their service center, they're committed to preserving our mountain playground for future generations. Last summer, after finishing Season 1, the 1990s, an old memory popped into my head of looking in a library that had a bunch of old climbing magazines. That library was owned by Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School, which was founded in 1965 right here in Lander, Wyoming. My memory turned out to be correct, and now the bulk of my research is done in that library. And at first I snuck in, then I sweet-talked the ladies at the desk, and finally I reached out to Knowles to see if they would be interested in partnering up. And because they have an interest in history, as well as fostering a love for our wilderness and public lands, they agreed. Thank goodness. I'm just too old to be sneaking into libraries. Knowles, dedicated to developing leaders. In 1978, two young Canadians, Peter Croft and Tammy Knight, drove into Yosemite Valley and climbed several 512s, a relatively new grade in one of the leading free climbing areas in the world. Coming from climbing in Squamish, the granite walls weren't entirely intimidating for the 20-year-old Croft, and it wouldn't be the last time he would swoop in and make his mark on the valley. But Yosemite did represent something bigger. And he'd used his time there to get over the jitters he'd been feeling about some of the big, unclimbed projects back home. One of those was the University Wall, a route that hadn't yet been free-climbed on the Stawamus Chief's Grand Wall. He'd been daydreaming about doing it, but hadn't worked up the belief that he was capable. Yet. In the spring of 1982, Peter went to Yosemite and repeated several long free routes, including an on-site of the famed Astroman, a route first done by Valley legends John Long, Ron Kalk, and John Bachar in 1975, an ascent that rewrote the rules of how big walls could be climbed. Peter thought it might prepare him for an attempt at the University Wall, and the confidence had gotten just to the threshold, but not quite over it. When the enthusiasm reaches that place, teetering on the edge, it can go either way. A month with no further validation, and it might fade away. But one willing partner could push it through the door. Croft had spent the summer climbing with Greg Fouraker and Hamish Fraser, and the trio were collectively susceptible to, well, liquid courage. Croft would later write, "One intoxicated night, the three of us gibbered away in ascending voices like monkeys at the zoo, till we'd worked up the courage to commit ourselves to the route. The remainder of that hazy evening was spent making lists, sorting, and packing. And so, with the food side of the venture taken care of, we threw together a rack and passed out." The next morning, the courage had solidified and the trio made their way up the trail to the chief. With Croft on the ground, his friends attacked the route first and made quick progress. Quick in the sense of got going quickly, but also in the sense of ended quickly. After 30 minutes, they were stuck and called for Peter. He reluctantly tied in, but quickly climbed to the current high point. There, he took a deep breath and continued into harder terrain, reaching the belay more relieved than excited. He fixed the rope and rappelled. A day or two later, the trio returned. On pitch 2, a long soaring corner, they reached an obvious crossroads. Peter had noticed this from town while sitting at the Dairy Queen eating ice cream. With the sun cutting across the chief, the laser-cut shadowed line running from bottom to top was obvious. But now, staring at the line straight ahead, it looked futuristically difficult. Much like Bachar on Medlicott Dome only a year earlier, they had to choose their adventure. Go straight up into the blank open book with a thin crack in the back, or go left out an underclean flake to another corner that looked considerably easier. Already a little freaked out by the difficulty, they chose to go left. Unlike Bachar, going left here was the right choice. The straight-up line, the one with the laser-cut shadow, would have to wait. Over the course of the first few days, they had managed to sort out the first 3 pitches, which, again, like Bachar's route into Tuolumne, would prove to be the crux. The next day out, they pushed the route higher to a spot known as Dance Ledge, where they traversed off. They had already free-climbed the 5 pitches above Dance, so technically, they had done it. But something kept eating at Peter. The ascent felt incomplete. The fixed ropes didn't sit quite right with him, and the fact that they hadn't done the whole thing in one push, going to the top, left a hole in his stomach that Dairy Queen couldn't fill. And so he talked with Hamish, who agreed. Greg had injured his ankle on the previous push and couldn't climb, but his contribution had already been cemented. Hamish and Peter would finish the job. A single day, a single push, all the way to the top. The university wall, free, would go at 512 minus and would not only stand on its own against the hardest big routes anywhere for the time, but more importantly, would whet the appetite of a young, hungry Peter Croft, who hiked off the top of the Chief, wanting more. Not more of the same. He wanted something more difficult, something that seemed even less plausible, something many would consider impossible. The confidence boost of University Wall was just what Peter needed. From that moment, his climbing progression began an upward trajectory that seemed like it might never stop. Like many climbers, Peter was following his own psyche and motivation, which for him meant more climbing, as many days and as many pitches as possible. This kind of volume would mean a high level of literacy on rock and a level of mastery rarely achieved. But because there weren't many people who had the time or stamina to keep up, he would collect much of this mileage free soloing. Still riding the high from the University Wall, Peter made his way to Washington to explore the climbing around Leavenworth. He would do lap after lap, soloing at Castle Rock, eventually working his way up to a finger and hand crack called ROTC at Midnight Rock. At 11C, and starting from a ledge way up on the wall, just pulling on meant instant exposure on difficult terrain. But with all of that mileage under his belt, up and down climbing tens of thousands of feet of finger cracks, Croft was locked in. ROTC was the first time he really felt out there on hard climbing, with no rope, but totally in control. The next year, beginning to understand the amount of terrain he could cover in this solo style, he began to imagine link-ups of big, classic routes. In the Bugaboos, he would link 4 routes, all on-site, all free solo for nearly 5,000 feet of vertical rock climbing, not counting the descents. In the 1984 Canadian Alpine Journal, he wrote, "Normally, when I solo, my face takes on a look of keen concentration, which some may mistake as blind fear. This time, though, had there been someone above me to see, they would have watched a grinning village idiot grope blindly up an off-route groove to stand blinking in the sun, legs braced wide on the summit, with nothing above to pull up on." He'd discovered a part of climbing that he absolutely loved. Moving over rock, unfettered, leaving nothing but footprints or faint chalk marks behind, suspended in a fantastical place between the summit above and the void below. And when he reached either of those places, he wanted to be back on that wall. In 1985, after driving through the night from Squamish, Croft arrived in the valley in a rainstorm. He got out of his car and began climbing. In the rain that would soon turn to snow, he soloed the northeast buttress of Higher Cathedral, then the Braille Book, then the first 5 pitches of the Central Pillar of Frenzy, for a total of over 2,000 feet of 5'8" and 5'9" crack climbing. He just couldn't help himself. For the entire 24-hour drive, he'd been considering and reconsidering the classics that he could do, unroped, by himself. He'd landed on the rostrum. At 800 feet tall and consisting mostly of 5'10 and 5'11 climbing, including a crux splitter finger crack on pitch 4 that went at 11C, the rostrum had been free climbed for the first time only 8 years earlier. Peter had, on a rope, done both the rostrum and its much harder sibling, Astroman, in a single day. He had plenty of fitness. He had the motivation. With all of those laps in Squamish and on routes like ROTC, he'd become a finger crack master. Maybe the best anywhere. And the more he thought about it, the more excited he got. When the valley dried, he hiked to the base. There was a party ahead of him, and they asked what he was going to do. But this was a personal thing. He didn't want to say that he was going to solo the rostrum, so he lied to them, said he was going to do the first few pitches and bail from a halfway ledge. And he started up. As he expected, and as he required for a solo, he was locked in. The crux finger crack pitch felt easier than ever, just a stroll on a sidewalk. And as he neared a slightly insecure smeary face move near the top of the wall, he noticed an old pin with a ratty sling attached to it. Facing the move, Peter decided to reach through the sling so that if he fell, the sling might catch his elbow. But as he walked off the top, it gnawed at him. The same stylistic ethics that made him return to the university wall when others would have called it done were echoing in his head. He returned the next day and soloed the route again, this time not reaching through the sling. The buzz on the valley floor was deafening.
He'd soloed it twice in 2 days?
John Bachar took notice. He'd been plotting something. Another statement. He'd kept to his ethics, still going ground up, still soloing hard routes, up into the 512s now, partly made possible by the new Boreal Phi Rays with sticky rubber that he'd started distributing in 1982. And he was certainly still one of the best climbers in California. However, he saw the sport climbing was speeding up and that it wouldn't slow down anytime soon. And he had an idea that he could take the next step in a risky game that could bring Yosemite back into the spotlight, a game that could make the best climbers in the world wonder if they had what it took, a game that he was uniquely suited for. And while it wasn't quite time just yet, if this new kid, Peter Croft, continued on this trajectory, he'd make the perfect partner. Look, I make my living as a climbing coach, but I'll be the first to tell you that ever since climbers first decided they wanted to get better, there's been one best way to improve: climb intentionally. So if you can do your climbing on terrain that was built specifically for that, it's a cheat code. And when it comes to this, there's one training board out there that stands above the rest: the Tension Board 2. Here's why. It was designed by people who actually train on boards. With mastery in mind, every decision made with purpose, and over 15,000 climbs in the database and growing, it's not even a question. On all levels, the TB2 is the final boss of training boards. The mix of wood and plastic allows for skin-friendly tiny grips as well as bigger, slopier, open-handed compression climbing. And there are 4 different board sizes to choose from, so whether you run a gym or built yourself a training shed, they've got one for you. And they also make, right here in the USA, a whole suite of premium training and performance goods. And you can get many of those for 15% off if you use the code WRITTEN15. Tension Climbing. Mastery over success. Driving to the valley a year later, in 1986, Peter was cooking up a new, audacious plan. He'd been considering it for a few years, but now it seemed like the obvious next step: El Cap and Half Dome in a single day. Since 1975, when Jim Bridwell, Billy Westbay, and John Long sped their way up the nose of El Cap in just under 18 hours, people had wondered, though not necessarily seriously, if someday the two iconic formations could be linked. And then, in 1984, a mild-mannered British climber named Duncan Critchley had teamed up with a Swiss guide named Roman Vogler, the only day the pair ever climbed together, and fired off the nose in only 9.5 hours, shocking the valley locals. Immediately, thoughts of doing El Cap and Half Dome back-to-back were flying all over. But even though it was obviously possible, it was still a daunting proposition. So far, nobody had stepped up. And while Peter had never climbed El Cap in a day and hadn't climbed Half Dome at all, he suspected that if he found the right partner, he could do it. He just wasn't sure who that partner might be. Stopping first at the Reed's Pinnacle parking area, before he could even get a pack out of his car, he saw a black 4Runner speed into the lot. Out jumps none other than Johnny Rock. John spoke first. "Hey, Peter, you want to go soloing?" Taken aback by the invitation from a climber he considered to be a superhero, it was all he could do to manage a yes. And as soon as they were into the woods, enough to be out of earshot of the climbers in the parking lot, Bachar turned to Croft and dropped a bomb on him. "What do you think about teaming up to do El Cap and Half Dome in a day?" Peter couldn't believe it. He later wrote, "I could practically hear the gears of the cosmos clicking into place as the planets aligned." He hadn't even considered Bachar as a potential partner. To him, John was the greatest. But to Bachar, it was clear that Peter was the best crack climber on the planet and the most capable soloist who'd ever lived. The pair spent the next couple of days climbing together to get a feel for the other. They did Half Dome as a practice climb and so that Peter would know the route. Planning ahead for the big link-up, Bachar mentioned that they should both take 2 rest days prior to starting up El Cap. Peter agreed that he would only do some easy soloing and a couple of runs, but Bachar wasn't having it. "Stay in your tent, sleep as much as possible, and eat as much as possible. Otherwise, expend no energy." Peter wasn't used to days actually off, particularly if the weather was good, but he deferred to Bachar and took the advice. Not having much money, Peter lined his tent walls with Nabisco crackers and proceeded to spend the next 48 hours drifting in and out of sleep and sitting up only to tear into another box of crackers. By the time the night arrived that they'd scheduled to start, he was chomping at the bit. At midnight, they clicked on their headlamps and stepped onto the nose. To Peter's surprise, the higher they got, the stronger he felt. In the dark hours, they tiptoed past sleeping parties, holding their cams steady so as not to wake anyone. As the sun rose, they were already high on the wall, and people were stirring awake. Near Camp 5, at around 2,000 feet, they passed 2 parties of climbers and got a pitch or 2 above them. Peter had followed the pitch but was swinging into the lead. Moving fast, he jumped onto a big block of granite, which immediately shifted and started falling away from the wall. With the world now moving in slow motion, Peter jumped from the block to the belay ledge as he imagined thousands of pounds of granite ricocheting down the wall, almost certainly killing some of the climbers below. Out of the corner of his eye came a blur, seemingly moving at double speed. John had jumped forward and pushed the tipping block back into place. He really was a superhero. From there, they charged to the summit. For the first time all day, Bachar and Croft paused to take it in. The watch read 10:05 a.m., still nearly 14 hours left to get the double done, and they realized that here on the summit, having climbed 3,000 feet of vertical granite, they felt better than they had at the start. And then, as quickly as possible, they made their way to the valley floor. They drove and rode mountain bikes to Half Dome, and by the afternoon were racked up at the base of the regular northwest face, below several parties who were slowly picking their way up the wall. Rolling in from the east were big, blue-black thunderheads. They were going to have to move. Only 2 hours in, halfway up the wall, with Peter in the lead, they came to a belay with an aid party about to embark on the next pitch. The group was moving exceptionally slow, and they made it crystal clear that Peter couldn't pass. Being Canadian and extra polite, he didn't offer much pushback on the refusal, but when John Bachar arrived at the belay, moving faster than the glacially paced aid climbers thought humanly possible, they stepped aside and let the superstar climb through. They even offered snacks, understanding that they were witnessing history. This trend continued with every party they met, until higher up, in a 5'9" chimney, the 7th total party they'd caught up to, they encountered that guy. You know the one. And it's always a guy. He's clearly territorial. He thinks he owns the place. And since he was here first, he has all of the rights. And honestly, maybe he does, but he still insists on being a jerk. He realizes the gravity of the situation, decides to make the considerate decision to let the faster team pass, but he's still going to grumble and get in the way, because if he isn't being a jerk, does he even exist? With John way above and way run out, the rope came tight and Peter began simul-climbing. John was confident that Peter wasn't going to fall in a 5'9" chimney, so he hadn't bothered to place much gear. So when that guy wouldn't let Peter into the back of the chimney where the climbing was secure, it put John into a bad situation, one he didn't even know he was in. Peter opted instead to climb on the outside of the chimney, stemming wide into much harder positions. Just as he was winding up to kick his foot high onto the opposite wall, that guy leaned out and Peter's boreal fillet connected directly with the jerk's soccer ball of a head. Peter's Canadian politeness, of course, caused him to blurt out an apology, but not without a hint of a spiteful giggle. By the time the delighted Croft made it to the next belay, the thunderheads had settled directly above them. Rain was starting to fall, and the static electricity in the air had their sun-bleached hair standing on end. Parties below were already bailing. But this team, moving faster than anyone ever had up one of the most iconic walls in the world, never even considered turning around. Bachar and Croft felt charged up, batteries now beyond full, and their climbing only accelerated. Across Thank God Ledge, up the 12A slab with no hesitation, skirting left of the visor, and they pulled over the summit just as the clouds moved past and a huge double rainbow formed over the valley. 4 hours and 20 minutes, the fastest time up the regular route, and they did it after climbing the nose. The first people to connect the two most famous walls in the most famous climbing area on the planet. They dropped their gear and sat down on a bench-sized block of granite to eat the bananas they'd brought along, feeling like they could keep going. Staring out at the storm rolling away and the setting sun, the skies lit up by the brilliant rainbows, Bachar knew what he'd done. For Croft, it was a fantastic day out climbing, a dream come true. But for Bachar, it was the start of a new game, a game that would require the risk and adventure that he so greatly valued and worried was disappearing from the sport that had given him so much. A game that could only play out on the big, incredible walls of Yosemite Valley. On July 5th, 2009, John Bachar, at 52 years old, fell while soloing near his home in Mammoth Lakes, California. For better or for worse, he stuck to his ethical stance for the rest of his life. It's been estimated that in his 30-year career, he climbed 1.5 million feet of rock, up to 513 in difficulty, without a rope.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. Shortly after John died, I wrote and produced a song in tribute of him and his unrelenting ethical stance that featured my friend Misty Murphy, but also John himself, playing saxophone, an offer he'd made to me only a few months earlier. I'll be posting that song on our Patreon, The Secret Stoners Club, later this week. You can join for free at the link in your show notes. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And if you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review. Join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know, at the crag, at the gym, and especially that guy, even if you have to kick him in the head to get the point across. And together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. I've gotten several messages recently from patrons who have had the chance to meet some of the guests that we've talked about, or email with them, or engage with them in some other way. And these podcasts have generated conversations and meetings, and that makes me feel really proud and happy that this thing is doing that. So thanks for sending those messages along, and I appreciate it. Speaking of appreciating, shout out to Chris Morse, our newest legend. Man, the fact that people are willing to pay for this thing means the world. So thank you. We're building something special here. I just wanted to give you a quick update. I know some of you were freaking out about the loss of the magazines at Knowles. I went and had a meeting with them, and they are going to do their best to get those magazines back on the shelf. The guy that I met with basically said, if that's what you want, that's what we'll do. So hoping that all ends up working out. It would be extremely helpful for future research. This episode, I thought, was going to be harder to write than it was. It was actually a pretty easy episode to put together. And I thought it was going to be harder because I expected to be more critical of John Bachar's ethics. Years ago, when I wrote the tribute song to him, which you guys will get either tomorrow or in a few days, when I wrote that, it was based around the idea that John had held on to his ethical stance for his whole life. He hadn't changed with the rest of climbing. And while I don't necessarily agree with that, I prefer the ability to change and to grow, but I had to respect that he held on to it, that he believed in it that much. So when I was writing this, and I decided to start it with the Bachar-Yerian, I thought the ethics he used were such a transgression from what he believed prior to that I would be critical. But I learned some things along the way that made me change my mind. And I mention those things in here, but I mentioned them kind of briefly. Number one, he gave it an aid grade. So he didn't call it a free climb initially. The climbing community in general ran with the free climbing grade, as they should have. It didn't need an aid climbing grade. But he also did what I lay out in this episode, where every time he would hand drill a bolt, he would then lower back down to a no-hand stance and climb from there, essentially making the climbing above that last bolt scarier than it already was, and it was already surely terrifying, just launching into no man's land with no possible protection, and hoping that maybe you would find something that you could put a hook on and hang from to drill a bolt. So he was making it harder on himself. In the episode, I say he was making it equal to what climbers in the future would do, but he was actually making it considerably harder for himself, which I wouldn't have done either. So I couldn't really critique it. I ended up just respecting it. Another part in this episode that really felt like kismet was there's a patron by the name of Duncan Critchley. Duncan, thank you for being in there and for your comments. And when I saw Duncan's name, it was shortly after I had written his name in my notes for this episode. And I mentioned Duncan in here. He's the British climber who did the nose in 9.5 hours with Roman Vogler. And they did it at a time when the valley was still the mecca of climbing, or maybe slightly coming off of that. But they swooped into the valley as these outsiders and did the nose in quite a bit faster time than anyone ever had. And that lit a fire under, at least in my narrative, and from what I can ascertain, reading things and listening to interviews, it lit a fire under some people. And I posit in here, and I believe that eventually led to Bachar and Croft doing the double in the way that they did. And there's a really great podcast that you all should go check out. It's called Factor 2, that's TWO. Look for the episodes 9.5 hours, and I think it's called Alone Off the Wall. It's by Will Treasure and UK Climbing, and both of those episodes are interviews with Duncan telling these stories in a really beautiful way. So Duncan, if you're listening here to this part, thank you. Thanks for being in the Patreon. Thanks for telling those stories. I do think it would have been interesting had, and I won't give anything away because you should go listen to those episodes, but had Duncan done the double first, because it was in his mind, it would have been a different game. The fact that Bachar and Croft, who were these Valley legend and upcoming, soon to be Valley legend, I think played into turning these speed link ups into something bigger. I would love to see if they would have turned into the same thing had Duncan done the link up. Obviously, we can't know that, but it is interesting to think about. All right, I've got a ton to get done before I leave for Vegas, where I'm going to a Tyler, the Creator show with my daughter. I leave in a few days, so I have a lot to get done before then. And that includes next week's episodes. There are 2 conversations coming. The next one that you'll get next Monday is a conversation with the climber who's the obvious torchbearer for John Bachar to Peter Croft to this climber. All right. I'll see you then.